Welcome back to another episode of my perimeter wall build for Legions Imperialis. On this week's episode, I'll be finishing up putting together the rooftop elements and battlements that'll go across the top of along the top of the walls. Along with that, I'll also be doing the, I guess you would call them floorboards. I'm not entirely sure what you call them for this. There's just the decoration that kind of go along the bottom here. Next week we'll probably get into painting, and so yeah, that's where we're at so far. Let's get into the video. My Civitas bits had mostly already been clipped from the sprues and sorted into a craft box, but I still needed to clean off the edges where they'd been clipped. I also sorted out the pieces so that each wall would have the same sort of details as the one next to it. So at this point I already had the kind of layout that I wanted figured out, and now I was just making sure that I had enough for each piece, which I did. I ended up having exactly enough to do the same sort of layout for the tops of every single wall. However, one of the things that I had forgotten about was that the rooftop pieces, they all have these little hatches. Well, some of the rooftop pieces have these little hatches. So I ended up having to clean those off so that I could get so that the plastic would glue flush to the plastic card. But that was pretty easy. A lot easier than it would have been clipping off the rooftop details on the other sides. As you can see here, I already have all my walls are already all glued to the bases. That would have been in the last week's video, except my camera ended up dying while I was gluing those in place. So that's why the previous video ended with me only gluing the end pieces to the bases for the destroyed wall sections. Also, the first of the rooftop bits all being glued together, that was all missed as well because for the first wall section, I missed all of that as well. And I think that was for a different reason, but probably I ran out of room on one of my memory cards. But I've since made changes to how I go about doing all of this. It's definitely a learning process for sure. But now I have extra memory cards with a lot more memory, and I'm a lot more vigilant about making sure that my camera's battery is charged or plugged in while I'm recording. You can see here one of the plastic card strips has a bit of a jagged edge on the end of it. I think what happened there was I'd accidentally glued the wrong piece on and didn't realize that until later, and then ended up having to break that piece off. Luckily, there was still enough for me to glue the bits that I really needed on there. So ultimately, the rooftop bits ended up they just kind of overshooting the length of the plastic card by, I don't know, maybe like 1/4 of an inch. So to fix that, what I did was I just took my ruler and used my razor to kind of score the bottom of the rooftop bits. And then I could pretty easily just break those pieces off. The piece with the broken plastic card edge, I ended up just taking one of the pieces that I'd already cut off of the end of another rooftop bit, putting that on, just kind of using that to measure where to cut for the 2 rooftop pieces that I needed for that one that was broken. You can also see I only have a couple of the Civitas bits glued to the back sides of the walls at this point, but we'll get to that in the next video. Far so good. Everything seems to be lining up pretty nicely. I'm really happy with it. So at this point, I'm just gluing on a couple of pieces of foam that I'd cut out for the pillars that go on either side of the gate. The rest of the wall pieces lined up here are not glued yet. And here I'm just going through the Imperialis Manufactorum terrain bits, just kind of sorting through all the different pipes, machinery, that kind of thing. Most of this stuff I'll end up using on the back side of the walls. There are a few things like the little ammo crates that I will end up putting on the top of the walls. You can see here I found something I think might look good on a destroyed wall section. To a point where I ran out of the pieces I planned on using for the battlements. Luckily though, my good friend and fellow Legions Imperialis player Ed had given me a full box of Civitas sprues, specifically because he knew I was working on this project. And that was pretty cool, thanks Ed. But that just means more clipping sprues. However, I don't really need to clip the entire sprue at this point since I'm just getting the handful of wall pieces that I'm missing. I'd been thinking about adding some other kind of details to the front of the walls, but I didn't want to just use more Civitas bits. Then I remembered I had a box full of very old Cities of Death terrain bits from, I don't know, I think they probably came out around the mid-2000s, but I wasn't sure if I had enough to cover the entire front of each wall section. I did end up having enough pieces to do what I wanted, but I would have to cut the newel posts from the ends of some of those old wall bits. I also needed to cut some of the Civitas walls for the battlements because I got to the ends and found the last piece was about 1/4 inch too long. So I swapped out the blade on my Dremel and set about trimming. For this process, basically what I did was I took one of my small C-clamps and I used that to just hold the plastic bit in place, and then took my Dremel to the edge of it and set about trimming. Now, before I can add those bottom wall pieces, I need to clean off the excess glue that had dried in glops kind of along the bottom edges. In order to clean off the excess glue, I just used a nice razor that I had with a pretty long blade kind of sticking out that I was able to use to get into those areas. And it was pretty easy to pick off. Really, all I had to do was just kind of cut along the edge, and then I was able to peel it off pretty easily. With that gunk out of the way, now I can just glue those pieces into place. All right, that's it for this week's video. Next week, we'll get all the walls to completion as far as the build goes, and then it's on to painting. Of course, still have to do the destroyed wall sections, and I still have to figure out a gate. We'll see you next week. Cheers.